Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Rev 250 speech tonight. I am Georgia Herring, and I am Secretary of the LaGrange Historical Society. I am also the LaGrange Town Historian, a member of the Steuben Society of Germania, Poughkeepsie. And we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Paul Lockhart here to talk to us about Steuben, Baron von Steuben. So, Paul Douglas Lockhart is Professor of History at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, where he has taught since earning his PhD at Purdue University in 1989. At Wright State, he teaches military history and the history of early modern Europe, especially Scandinavia. Lockhart has written 7 single-author books, including Frederick II and the Protestant Cause, Denmark's Role in the Wars of Religion, Denmark, 1513 to 1660, The Rise and Decline of a Renaissance Monarchy, The Drillmaster of Valley Forge, The Baron de Steuben and the Making of the American Army, and his latest, Firepower, How Weapons Shaped Warfare. He has held fellowships and grants from the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Scandinavian Foundation, the Danish American Heritage Society, and the American Philosophical Society. In addition to his position at Wright State, Lockhart has served as lecturer at the University of Southern Denmark and the National Endowment for the Humanities visiting distinguished professor at SUNY Potsdam. From 2014, Wright State named Lockhart as the Brage Golding Distinguished Professor of Research, and in 2022 awarded him the WSU Trustees Award for Faculty Excellence, Wright State's highest scholarly honor. Ohio Academy of History voted him the Ohio Distinguished Professor for 2020-21. In 2021, he was elected to membership in the Royal Danish Society for History, Det Königlige Danske Selskab til Historia. I tried to say that as it was German, for his lifelong contributions to the study of the history of Denmark. Lockhart's connection to Dutchess County: he grew up in the town of LaGrange as my neighbor, and is a 1981 graduate of Royce C. Ketchum High School. So please welcome Dr. Lockhart.
So we're supposed to wear the microphone? This? Sorry, to get going, you have to.
No problem.
Okay, just put it in the pocket. Sorry, folks, this feels remarkably awkward, but there we go. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Georgia, for that introduction, and thanks for that valiant attempt to speak Danish. You know, as Swedes often say, Danish is not a language; it's a pathological condition of the larynx, and that's not far from the truth, I think. And as somebody who speaks Danish, I can attest to that. And thanks all for attending tonight. I really do appreciate it. This is the second time I've been at Mount Gulian. I was here in October of 2016, and it's a real thrill, honestly, to be able to talk about the Baron in a place that was a very important part of his life during the later years of the Revolution. I have, Georgia listed a bunch of my books, and I love all of them for one reason or another, but I have a special attachment to Drillmaster of Valley Forge. Incidentally, I did not choose the title. That was a committee decision. My brother remarked after that the book came out that he was pretty sure Drillmaster was a piece of shop equipment and not a person. I see his point. But it's of all the things I've written, first of all, it was written for a more general audience, but that it was purely biographical. It's the only purely biographical book I've ever written, which allowed me to get into Steuben's personality in a depth that I hadn't with anybody else before. But a lot of it has to do with that personality, with Steuben's personality, because it's extraordinarily complex. And like so many figures from the Revolutionary era, I think because they're part of this pantheon of heroes, that we tend to mythologize them. I'm going to return to that subject in just a minute, which I think causes us to kind of flatten who they are and to look for some maybe for virtues that weren't necessarily there, and to forget about the humanity of these individuals. And Steuben, for everything he accomplished, certainly had a lot of flaws. He's a very, very strange man in many ways, and in some ways that as much time as I spent with him, and I don't know how many thousands of documents are in the Steuben Papers collection, plus all those in a variety of other collections that deal with him. I can't say in a lot of ways that I know him. But I think I have a reasonably good idea about him, obviously, or I wouldn't have written a book about it. So what I'd like to do today this evening is to talk a little bit, not just about what Steuben accomplishes, not just to give you a biography of his life, but in particular to see how it is that we perceive him today, how that might differ from at least what I've found in my work on him, and why that is, what the difference is, and what exactly he managed to contribute. Because again, I think even more than perhaps most of the maybe second tier of founding fathers, right? I mean, certainly not up at Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington level, but he has some name recognition, at least with people who have read something about the Revolution, that I think we sometimes don't fully appreciate all that they did contribute, because it's obviously very easy to be overshadowed by somebody like George Washington. So first of all, when I talk about mythologizing, I want to say something a little bit about that, because I bring that up not just with this, I also bring it with my the book I wrote on Bunker Hill, which came out after this, called Whites of Their Eyes. One of the things that drew me to Bunker Hill, as what drew me to Steuben, is the fact that we have misinterpreted quite a few things about him. Maybe they're very little things individually, but when we put them together collectively, they result in a person who is significantly different, I think, than the one that we've become familiar with. And I often refer to that as being a result of American historical mythology. Now, as somebody who's a historian who does history for a living, I oftentimes point out to my students that there's a huge difference between history and heritage, right? History is, as far as we can determine what happened. Heritage is when we take history very often and kind of use it to one end or another. For example, within genealogy, very often people are more interested in heritage and in knowing, being able to be proud of what their ancestors did. Where historians, generally speaking, aren't really all that concerned with making people feel good about themselves. But when I'm talking specifically about mythology, what I mean when I say national historical mythology are those stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. To explain to us why we are the way that we are, how we got to be that way. When it comes to American historical mythology, it's the stories we tell ourselves to understand what makes us different as Americans, what makes us different from other people, especially considering, historically speaking, the United States has been such a polyglot assemblage of peoples. What makes us American? And where it comes to the Revolution, that takes on an even greater significance because we're talking about that moment, right? The moment that we become America. And for that reason, I think we tend to tweak the details of what we see historically in order to make the narrative more exciting, make the narrative a little bit more black and white. As I pointed out in my book on Bunker Hill, I promise I'll stop talking about my book on Bunker Hill because it's not what I'm here to talk about with that. That we tell ourselves in the Revolution that we fought the biggest and best army in the world. And the British Army was neither the biggest nor the good army, but it's certainly not anywhere near the biggest. And we like to contrast between Americans who have a natural affinity for war, who fight like Native Americans, and the British who use completely irrelevant European tactics, most of which is demonstrably false. But it plays into that notion of mythology, again, of assigning some mythic qualities to our origin story, and I see that with Steuben as well. Now, so what I'd like to address with Steuben are what those myths are, and then talk about what makes them myths. First of all, I want to point out something that, just in case I lapse into this, you don't think I've forgotten my meds this morning, which is the pronunciation of the name. Okay. Hochdeutsch, in High German, it's Steuben, right? We do know, however, that, or at least I think it's easily verifiable, that this is probably not how his name was pronounced by Americans. It's probably not how he pronounced his name once he was in America. You'll see very often, especially if you've seen the cover of my book, I refer to him as the Baron de Steuben in the French fashion, which is exactly how he referred to himself. It's an interesting thing to see when you look at the archives regarding Steuben, is that the term Baron von Steuben never shows up. Okay? It's an early 19th century formulation of the term, done primarily by very proud German Americans who wanted to claim Steuben as their own. Baron is not a German title. It's French and English. He was the Freiherr von Steuben, and Freiherr translates generally into French as Baron or Baron. And when Steuben first made himself available to Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin in Paris, he presented himself as a worldly officer, a very cosmopolitan, and this is, after all, the Enlightenment, right? French is the language of the Enlightenment. German is seen as being kind of provincial. Frederick the Great himself, Frederick the Great of Prussia, preferred French to German, as did many of his officers. So we know from just simply from his own letters that he signed himself either as Baron Steuben, or just simply as Steuben, or as the Baron de Steuben, but never Baron von Steuben. That is a later creation. I bring that up, and it sounds kind of emphatic. You wouldn't believe how much hate email I got about this when the book came out. Oh, I bet the Baron's descendants are angry at you. Well, the Baron doesn't have any descendants. He didn't have any children. The Baron must be rolling in his grave. This is like saying the Marquis von Lafayette. Well, saying Baron von Steuben is like saying the Marquis von Lafayette. So in case I say Steuben sometimes, or Steuben, or Steuben, that's why. Because there's no real correct way to say it in a way. It's clear that Americans referred to him. The Americans, for example, like to spell things phonetically in the 18th century. You very often see his name spelled Stoobin. It's pretty clear how that's meant to be pronounced, and it's not Steuben. Right? So just so you understand, and this is something that also is kind of difficult to grasp unless you're fairly familiar with 18th century Europe or with the Western world during the Enlightenment. Steuben didn't see himself as a German. Occasionally he'd make reference to that. He always presented himself as being European. He saw himself, like a lot of philosophers, thinkers of the Enlightenment, as being kind of above national identities. Right? So that's part of it. It's kind of key to Steuben's personality. Well, we got that one out of the way, so please don't hate mail over his name. If you want to talk about that, I'm more than happy to afterwards. So what about the myths, besides the name? First of all, there's a way that we tend to, or that Revolutionary War scholars, or in popular histories of the Revolution, we see Steuben presented. And that is, in fact, as the Drillmaster, right? As this Prussian officer who shows up at Valley Forge relatively early in the Valley Forge winter. He's taken aboard by George Washington. He retrains the Continental Army, and all of a sudden they go from being ragtag and disorganized to being the army that pretty much wins Monmouth in June of 1778. Right? That he drills the men, and this is the thing that the way he's always portrayed in popular histories or even scholarly histories of the Revolution. He teaches the men his new drill manual. He swears at them a lot in German and French and English. He gets his francophone assistants to translate his French curses into English for him. And this is again part of, I think, of that mythic quality of Steuben. He's almost kind of the comic relief of the Continental Army leadership. He's the one who gets a kind of a chuckle out of us, but it's an appreciative one rather than a derisive one. One thing I want to show tonight is that what he did at Valley Forge, I don't even say it's the tip of the iceberg. It's probably one of the least important things that he did. Okay? It's one of the easier to grasp, but it's not necessarily all that important within the general scheme of the Revolution. Closely attached to that, and I revere the late Tom Fleming, a great popular author of the Revolution. But a term that we argued about this and discussed it at one point, that he used that I really take objection to is he referred to Steuben as the magnificent fraud. right? That Steuben was somebody who passed himself off as being somebody other than who he actually was, right? And so that every aspect of his identity, when he comes to America at the end of 1777, presents himself to the Second Continental Congress, then at York early in 78, and then goes on to Valley Forge, almost everything that he presented was wrong. He's not really a noble. He's not really a baron. He certainly is not a general. He certainly did not have any close contact with Frederick the Great warrior king in the middle of the 18th century. But we forgive him that because it makes him kind of Barnum-esque, right? He still is competent. He still gets a lot done. And he fibs a little bit, right? So that's okay. So again, it kind of fits into that whole comic relief. And it fits in, I think, also to a very American notion that we admire mavericks, right? We admire people who don't exactly play by the rules and maybe puff themselves up a little bit, but ultimately manage to gain some results. So the problem with that is, and I think it's kind of dismissive actually, is that virtually everything that we're told about him being fraudulent, he was not being fraudulent about. And a lot of it comes from the fact that historians of the Revolution simply very often don't have the training in European history, don't understand maybe some of the nuances of European society at the time that Steuben was alive, and I'll be getting back to that in just a minute. Another one is a really small one, but it always irks me a lot, and I don't know why. It's that notion that Steuben goes to Paris and Benjamin Franklin recognizes him as being a great potential leader and brings him over. Franklin wanted to reject him. Franklin did not like Steuben. Right? Silas Deane did. Silas Deane of Connecticut. How many people have heard of Silas Deane of Connecticut? A few, right? I mean, he's one of those kind of second-tier founding fathers who deserves a lot more credit than he gets. His main sin is that he's not Benjamin Franklin, right? So we don't remember him quite as well. He's not quite as eccentric or quotable as Benjamin Franklin. But Silas Deane recognized merit in Steuben, but Franklin did not. Eventually, Franklin comes on board, but it really was Silas Deane who made that leap, who risked angering Congress, Second Continental Congress, by bringing over yet another unproven, untested foreigner to get a commission in the Continental Army. I'll get back to that as well. There's another one that sometimes I'm hesitant to bring up, but it always comes up because if you Google Steuben, it will come up. And that is the idea that potentially Steuben was gay. Right? When Drillmaster first came out in 2008, it was kind of a fringe opinion. Right? And now it's kind of the dominant one. So there's an AP article on this that quoted a few people with whom I've discussed this, but nobody really knew anything about Steuben. And here's the thing. Questions about his sexuality have been around for a very long time. At one point, I would say, in fact, maybe 20 years ago, there was speculation that maybe Steuben had single-sex romantic relationships. And recently, it's more like Steuben is actually gay in the 21st century sense of the term, and that he was perhaps even at kind of the center of this gay subculture that existed within the Continental Army leadership, which is really not proven or either provable or disprovable. But I'll get back to that. My point with this is, or my big point with it is, what difference does it make in terms of his achievements? But it's because it's become such a central part of the Steuben story. I think it has to be addressed at least a little bit. So those are the main ones, and I want to take those apart one by one. First of all, as to his origins. Steuben was born not by the name that we know him as, but rather as Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben, born in Magdeburg in 1730, the son of a colonel of engineers in the Prussian army. Colonel was about as high-ranking as one could get as an engineer, and again, this is the Prussian army. This is the army that Mirabeau characterized Prussia as being the army with a country rather than the other way around. Right? A really small kingdom and a gigantic army. Steuben's father was a colonel of engineers. He was, in fact, legitimately noble. Now, again, anybody could just say that. I want to say just a little bit by way of proof of that. First of all, I think in the past, when historians have looked at Steuben, they've just assumed nobles are rich. I think we have that assumption. And that nobles and aristocrats are the same thing. And so many, I think a couple of Revolutionary War historians off the top of my head, who say that Steuben was never an aristocrat like he claimed to be. He never claimed to be an aristocrat, he claimed to be a noble. There is a difference. Nobility is the privileged class of Europe. Being noble means your parents were noble. It doesn't mean you have money. Okay? If you're an aristocrat, you're part of the upper echelon, maybe the upper third, maybe quarter of the nobility, and then you probably have a lot of landed estates and a great deal of influence. But in Prussia in particular, there was a really large nobility. We refer to them as the Junker. And the Junker were a service nobility. They had certain privileges, like exemption from taxes, for example, like nobles tended to have. But the main thing was, if you're born into the Junker, you have a guaranteed spot either as an officer in the army or as a fairly high-ranking individual in the civil service. In other words, you have security as a member of the Junker class. And this is the kind of family Steuben's born into, a family that has served the state for many generations. Not rich, not exactly poor either. But certainly not rich. Let me lost my track of what page I'm on. There we go. Okay. Three of his four grandparents. One was demonstrably from a long-term noble family. Two of them were from princely families. In other words, they were from the ruling dynasties of small Germany is divided to 300 some odd independent states, semi-independent states at this point. And one of his grandfathers was ennobled. In other words, he had been a commodore who had been made into a noble. Even without him, three of his four grandparents were noble, which is good enough to make him noble. But in technically speaking, all of his grandparents are noble. Steuben's a noble. His father, Wilhelm von Steuben, the colonel of engineers, married a noble woman from an East Prussian family. So there's no debating Steuben's nobility. And again, it seems like a minor point, perhaps, but it was a big deal to his American contemporaries, and certainly to Revolutionary War historians since then. Now, as to the idea that he might have been a general, Steuben was not a general. And the thing is, Steuben never said he was a general until he was told to say he was a general. His background actually is pretty in the Prussian service is actually pretty significant. He started out as an officer cadet and then a lieutenant in the infantry regiment von Lestwitz. This is in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Saw action several times. His bravery, his physical bravery under fire was noted. He was adjutant for what we call one of the free battalions that Frederick the Great created. He was captured by the Russians and for a while was in Russian captivity. And after he was released from Russian captivity, he managed to attract the attention of Prince Heinrich, of Prince Henry of Prussia, Frederick the Great's brother, who was something of a scout of military talent. And ultimately, Steuben ended up in a special group within the royal suite. By what I mean the royal suite are those officers who attended upon the king himself, upon Frederick the Great. Referred to as a Spezielle Klasse der Kriegskunst, a special class in the art of war. And Frederick the Great had created this basically as a way of taking young promising officers and turning them into senior promising staff officers and potentially generals. In other words, Steuben was picked as an infantry captain for this very exclusive group of people who were being fast-tracked into positions of command. Did Steuben get there? No. The 7 Years' War ends. Steuben did something to tick off one of Frederick the Great's adjutants, and he finds himself dismissed from the service at the end of the 7 Years' War. And with Europe at peace, peace breaks out all throughout Europe in 1763, Steuben didn't have a prayer of finding a job as an officer. So definitely he was kind of on a career path to being a general. He clearly was not a general. He was advised by a couple of his American friends to present himself that way. But one thing is relatively clear from looking at all this. Steuben knew better than the vast majority of Americans who held high-ranking positions of command in 1775, or in 1778 for that matter. The art of war, from company command to the planning of large campaigns with large armies. In other words, he had the actual physical experience, he had the intellectual rigor and depth to understand the art of war. This becomes really apparent when he starts to work with the Continental Army, especially when he composes, the one piece of writing he's renowned for, the Blue Book, the first official manual of the U.S. Army, which is first published in 1779. So Steuben, I should backtrack just one little thing before we get back to him in America, which is the whole Baron thing and the medal that he wore on his chest. Now, I have my PowerPoint presentation. I forgot to bring my laptop, so I can't really, my graphical skills are pretty juvenile, so I won't subject you to that. Because I had a portrait I wanted to show you, a fairly rare portrait from Germany for a private collection. In 1767, one of Steuben's closest friends, Friederike von Hohenzollern, who was the consort of the German Prince of Württemberg, German Duke of Württemberg, took on a role kind of as Steuben's patron and was instrumental in getting him awarded an honorific in the so-called Hausorden der Treue, the House Order of Fidelity, granted by the Margrave of Baden-Durlach, just another one of these German principalities. And with membership in that order, which required noble birth, by the way, came the title of Freiherr, of Baron. And so he wore this badge on him throughout the Revolution. You see it in a lot of portraits of him. Even have famous portraits of Washington bidding farewell to his generals at Fraunces Tavern in 1783. You can tell Steuben just by the fact that he's got this big obnoxious medal sewn to the left breast of his coat. But this is where Steuben's title of Baron comes from. It is entirely legitimate. It's entirely within the range of the ordinary, in other words, amongst German nobles and German soldiers in the middle of the 18th century. So we have Steuben having lost his job. Europe is at peace. Steuben ends up becoming essentially a professional courtier. He spends a fair amount of the remaining 13, 14 years in the service of the prince of a really tiny German state, Hohenzollern-Hechingen, which involves him essentially babysitting the children of the ducal couple, which is a job that he doesn't especially like. He just found that he didn't really like taking girls shopping. Essentially, was a fair amount of activity was that he wanted. Steuben was one of those people, one of those soldiers who loved battle. I mean, they felt a thrill from battle, and he craved being back in that situation. Ultimately, and I'm not going to go into too many details, but he does try to secure employment in a number of European armies, including the British Army, in fact, repeatedly, to the French Army, etc. None of these leads pan out. It's really fairly late in 1777 that he hears that not only is there this war going on in America, but that the rebels are looking for experienced European officers, which at that point they certainly were. Silas Deane and later Benjamin Franklin were taking applications from scores of French officers who either were down on their luck, were disappointed by the lack of opportunities for advancement, or just wanted to get in the thick of things. Some of them saw it as an opportunity to get rich, of course, not really understanding that the Continental Congress really didn't have a lot of money to give out, as you might imagine. So Steuben ultimately, and again, there's a few other steps in between here that I'm glossing over for time's sake, ultimately ends up in Paris, calling on his allies within the French government. He had, for example, ties with Vergennes, the French foreign minister. He was, by those means, able to get an interview ultimately interviews with Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane. Initially, Steuben was not interested in what they had to offer, which wasn't much. At this point, by the way, late 1777, Deane and Franklin are being told there's too many foreigners here. You're bringing over too many French lieutenants and captains who have no idea what they're doing, and they all expect to be made generals, and they're really ticking off our officers. who don't see that these individuals have any more merit than they do. So there, in other words, Dean and Franklin are supposed to be minimizing, if not completely cutting off the flow of officers from France to the United States. But Steuben ultimately takes a deal, largely out of desperation, of going to America, given free passage by the French government, as a volunteer without promise or guarantee of a commission. And it's under that assumption that there's no job waiting for him in America that he goes over at the end of 1777. But Steuben was Steuben, and Steuben was an extraordinarily charming man. I mean, it's one thing that becomes obvious from anybody who wrote anything about him, that he was in equal measure infuriating and charming. Fortunately, the infuriating doesn't show up yet at this point. Steuben manages to wow his hosts in Boston and New York, and ultimately with the Second Continental Congress, where he immediately came on very good terms with Henry Lawrence, who at that point was the president of the Second Continental Congress. And with their blessing and their recommendation, he is sent on to Valley Forge and to Washington. Again, skip over a few things here. Washington was immediately suspicious of Steuben, mostly because he had good reason to be suspicious of European officers pretending to have experience that they didn't actually have. But Steuben manages to make friends within the officer corps, especially his earliest allies, none other than Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence, who not only were themselves young, ambitious, intelligent aides, but also both spoke French fluently, which meant that Steuben had translators with him. I think by this point Steuben actually understood English a lot better than he let on. I think he used sometimes a feigned ignorance of English to get what he wanted to get when it was advantageous to do so. But that's where he gets the assignment as Drillmaster. Washington gives him the task of training troops, and Steuben does that. Now, ultimately, the end result of this is going to be the Blue Book, and the first official manual of the U.S. Army, published in Philadelphia in 1779. It's going to incorporate a drill manual, which has all the basic features of any drill manual of the period. It's very often said that Steuben took a simplified version of the drill he knew as a Prussian soldier, and that's wrong. The British Army was using a simplified version of the Prussian system. Steuben created something that came from a grab bag of European infantry manuals. I mean, the whole library that he and his French assistants had to come up with a system that he thought would work well with Americans. It was actually a very low priority for him. When he was told he had to come up with a new drill manual, he was kind of balked at it. This is anybody can do that. My talents are being wasted here. But in terms of training, Steuben did a couple things that were kind of important at Valley Forge early on. First of all, creating a system by which he trained those who would train. In other words, he was assigned a model company that consisted of junior officers and NCOs from all over the Army. He trained them, then they go on to their units to train their respective units. Interesting for those of you who might be drill heads. I know there's any out here. I know I was a teenage drill head. But the Steuben emphasized far more than how you carry the musket, the manual of arms, than he was in marching, in the simple elements of marching, which, as he saw, Americans weren't especially good at, and that 18th century tactics required a great deal of precision in. So again, granted, Steuben gets a lot done during the Valley Forge winter in 1778. A couple of things I want to point out about that. Make sure I'm not going too far. Point out about that time at Valley Forge that illustrates something about his character. First of all, in terms of the effectiveness of what he manages to accomplish, the fact that the Continental Army, the detachment of the Continental Army led by none other than Lafayette. By the way, Steuben hated Lafayette. They really two did not like each other. But that Lafayette led an expedition to Barren Hill in May of 1778, which ended up very nearly being a disaster, the fact that the American Army managed to extract itself from that near disaster was generally credited, but even by some of Steuben's opponents, to Steuben and his training of the Army. And I think that just seeing the difference between the American Army at Germantown in October of 1777 and at Monmouth in June of 1778 shows you that this is a completely different army. It's an army that has some uniformity to it. And I'll get back to that in just a minute, the notion of uniformity. I do want to point out, too, that at Valley Forge, we're beginning to see some signs of Steuben as a person who irritated others a lot. Steuben had very simple ideas about competence and incompetence. Competence needed to be rewarded, incompetence needed to be punished or dismissed. And he understood that he knew the mechanics of army organization probably better than anybody else, including Washington, at Valley Forge in 1778. So when some officers objected to his training regimen, they didn't like the fact that the Washington's Inspector General, as he was already informally being called, was given authority over the training of their regiments. Steuben was furious. Well, you don't know how to do it, so of course it's up to me. And he presented this to Washington all the time. Well, if the officers are complaining that I don't have the authority to train their troops, well, the solution is simple. Give me more authority. Give me authority over them. And already this is beginning to become a sticking point between Steuben and other Continental officers. This German just shows up from nowhere and he demands the right to command our troops and train them the way that he sees fit. And fortunately, Washington is the kind of thing, of course, Washington was great at, was smoothing over issues like this. That Washington managed to handle this by means of making Steuben his subordinate and making failure of the officers to train their troops adequately according to Steuben's terms something that they would be answerable to Washington for. In other words, Washington's taking away the authority from Steuben, but he's working with Steuben. Minor point, but already you're beginning to see this aspect of Steuben as a man who easily makes enemies, almost as easily as he makes friends. Now, I mentioned uniformity as being kind of an issue with the Continental Army. It's something that Steuben recognized. Actually, most leaders of the Continental Army recognized that the troops were being trained with different drill manuals, that regiments were wildly varying in terms of their size, things that Steuben wanted to be able to work out but couldn't entirely. He saw no reason why we can't just make all regiments the same size by taking a few Rhode Islanders and putting them in a New Jersey regiment, for example, which of course horrified Americans. What, people from out of state are foreigners, right? If you're from Connecticut, you don't want somebody from Massachusetts in your regiment. That's awful. So Steuben wasn't able to do all the things that he really wanted to do. But he understood that there were some very basic things he could. And I think one of the most brilliant of those, and it again goes to show how Steuben's experience contributed to the creation, not just of a victorious army, but of an army that worked. An army that actually had a working infrastructure instead of being a kind of disorganized mob that improvised every procedure. He introduced the notion of the soldier's book. Every soldier would be issued a book in which would be listed his pay every time he was paid, what he received, every item of equipment and of uniforming that he was issued. He was even ammunition, individual cartridges were to be listed in the soldier's book. Why is this a problem? Well, the soldiers, when their enlistments run out, if they don't re-enlist, they walk off and they take their haversack and their musket and their bayonet and their cartridge box and everything else that they got from Uncle Sam. And Steuben said, we can't do this. We don't have muskets to just give away to people. And so in the soldier's book, everything that is issued is listed. And when you leave, or when you're inspected every morning, right, by the captain or the ensign of your company, and you're missing your bayonet, you better find it, because otherwise your pay is docked for that. When you go out on guard duty and you're issued 5 rounds of ammunition, you better come back with 5 rounds of ammunition, or have a report explaining why you fired any. Right? So these things seem really, minor, but of course these are the kind of minor details that armies function on. And they're not the kind of things that Continental Army officers were immediately aware of because they didn't have, again, that level of experience that Steuben did. What's interesting, though, I think, with Steuben's personality, is that this is really his great achievement. He's training the army, organizing the army, creating an infrastructure, and he hated every minute of it, except for those moments where he got to show off how skilled his army was. For Planck's Point, for example, when he gets to show French generals how well the army can conduct some basic combat maneuvers. Steuben beamed with pride at that, but he thought this is work that's beneath him. Steuben really wanted to be a combat commander. And he thought that any day Washington would do that. At Monmouth, when the army chases the British Army into New Jersey, Steuben actually had temporarily a combat command, and he thought he proved himself. He actually did reasonably well at Monmouth. But he didn't understand Washington's dilemma, which is that we've got lots of American officers who have as much claim on a major generalship as you do, and you've only been here a short while. Right? Steuben did not understand the politics of the army, and it rankled him. And this is really where he starts to become unreasonable, for example, with his American hosts, and why he oftentimes made enemies. Good example of that, when he was working on the Blue Book. He was in Philadelphia with Etienne Duponceau and a few other French assistants, working on the manual, trying to find engravers who would make the plates for the manual. The manual had plates illustrating the position of a soldier under arms, how a company deploys from column into line, etc. The plates were vitally important. It was very hard to find an engraver in Philadelphia in 1779 because the pay wasn't that good. And for some reason in 1779, privateering was really popular. Privateering promised a fair amount of pay. Right? So Steuben couldn't find engravers because they're all off on privateers. But he didn't see it that way. He saw Congress trying to hobble his work. Congress trying to make things hard for him because he's a foreigner. And he blows his top about it a couple of times. And even his best friends are embarrassed and angry with him, for essentially throwing temper tantrums about things that weren't even vaguely true. But that was one of the things, in fact, that hobbled Steuben. Now, it doesn't help. Now, Steuben does get this reputation of being kind of a prickly foreigner, right? And somebody who thinks he's better than us. It doesn't help, too. This is, I think, one of the more fascinating aspects of Steuben's personality. It doesn't help that he, while he proved to be a good manager of military resources, he was really lousy at managing his own. Money just seemed to slip through his fingers. It didn't help that he loved clothes. So one thing I noticed when I went through Steuben's papers, how many receipts there were for hats and plumes and jackets and vests and lace. He loved clothes. Also, how many of those receipts were, hey, you bought this 2 years ago, you still haven't paid yet, because Steuben was not very good with his money. He was also very generous with other people. A famous episode where he pawns some of his own goods so that his aides can receive medical attention. Very generous man in that way, but somebody who was really unable to, put it this way, Ben Walker or Billy North who said that the Baron is and forever will be eating the calf in the cow's belly. That he was always, in other words, spending money they didn't have yet, which is something that certainly would affect the comfort of his later years. And for that reason, Steuben became, and especially in his later years, very concerned about getting paid. And understandably so. I mean, Congress was really pretty awful about paying him. Fortunately, he had an ally in Thomas Jefferson in this, which is a whole different backstory to that, which I won't get into, except that Jefferson, of course, was war governor of Virginia in the later part of the Revolution, and he and Steuben clashed frequently over the defense of Virginia against the British, especially against the invasion of Benedict Arnold in 1780, 1781. And Steuben very often was quite rude with Jefferson. What do you mean you can't man that fortification? You're the governor. Just make people go there and man it. And Jefferson would say, well, it's a free state. I can't make people do anything they don't want to do. There's an interesting interchange, for example, one of my favorites, and I just have to mention it, where Jefferson was contemplating a new style of hat for light infantry troops in the Virginia line. And he wanted Steuben to come to Williamsburg to look over these designs for a hat. And Steuben just infuriated. I've got thousands of other things to do, and the governor wants to talk about hats with me. But that aside, Jefferson was Steuben's ally after the war, pushing for Steuben to get the recompense that he felt that Steuben deserved, and that Steuben felt he deserved. Ultimately, after the war is over, Steuben gets a certain amount of that money. But for for much of the last couple of years of the war, Steuben is continually haranguing Congress about where's his pay, where's his back pay, why aren't his expenses being paid as he was told they would be paid. And the reason I mention that is because it does have an impact on Steuben's outlook on America, and more importantly, on the American government after the war. Steuben considered himself to be an American by 1783. However, he also wasn't especially happy here in many ways, and he continually threatened that he would go back to Europe and retire to his estates and emoluments. Of course, he didn't have any estates or emoluments in Europe. It was an empty threat. And the fact of the matter is, Steuben could not afford to leave America once he was here. But he began to see, in the post-war years, a government that had betrayed what its soldiers had fought for. A Congress made up of people who had profited from the war, not the same individuals who had started the war, and did not appreciate fully, especially did not appreciate fully the sacrifices of Continental soldiers and officers. This hurt Steuben deeply, even more so, I think, than the issues about pay. And so for the last 2 years of his life as an impoverished socialite in New York City, and then later as a kind of a hermit living in upstate New York, near the village of Remsen, which was a howling wilderness at the time, that he became kind of a really cynical, sharp-tongued political pundit. He, as he said once, this is after a really bitter exchange with Congress, as long as I live in this damned republic, I'll at least have the liberty of laughing whenever I feel a disposition for it, which God knows is seldom. When Shays' Rebellion broke out in Massachusetts in the autumn of 1786, the rebellion to get back pay primarily for Continental Army officers and for tax relief for officers who had been poorly treated. Steuben sided with the rebels. I mean, he didn't physically fight with them, but he cheered them on. Even though, his good friend Henry Knox, the former artillery commander, was Secretary at War under Washington, Steuben sided with the rebels. And with a number of quotes come from Steuben's editorials at that point. For example, it seems to me that we have neither the virtue nor the wisdom to be a democratic republic. At one point, he wrote to Prince Henry of Prussia, his old comrade in the Prussian army, asking him to come to America to be kind of a monarch of a constitutional monarchy. And when Prince William Henry, the son of George III, Prince of Wales, expressed an interest in visiting the United States in 1786, which is a big deal, an English royal visiting the United States shortly after the end of the war, Steuben wrote, kind of bemusedly, "It doesn't surprise me. Eagles are always about when the scent of carrion is in the air." The implication being the United States is on its last legs. The European powers are going to be circling pretty soon. And that's that dissatisfaction with American political life, I think, that led him to deciding to spend his last years essentially in the howling wilderness of upstate New York. And there he hoped to have the kind of aristocratic retreat they had never actually been able to have in Europe. He was going to build a manor house and invite land-hungry New Englanders to farm his land, and it didn't work out very well, obviously. There were very few tenants who would take it up, and the manor house that he built was a lot farther away from the Mohawk River than he originally thought that it was, so it was not really a well-placed manor house. And he ended up dying there, of course, poor and essentially alone in November of 1794. Maybe all this sounds like a scathing assessment, and we tend to think of the Baron as this good-natured, jovial guy full of bon mot, right? That he's responsible for these witticisms, that he's kind of this, again, the comic relief of the Continental Army. But I think it's an honest assessment, and one of the reasons I like to point that out is not just to point out all the warts on a person who's been portrayed to us really as a marble man, but because I think if we don't appreciate the complexity of his character, and I think this is true really with any historical figure, we're doing him a disservice. When we just make him the subject of myth, we're flattening out all those things that make him human. And to me, and again, this is not just with the Revolution, but I think it's especially true with the Revolution, that we see with people like Steuben, I mean, not just an immigrant done well, I mean, there's definitely that, but that the truly great things that happen in the history of our country are made by those whose greatness is brought out in crisis. And sometimes those people ordinarily are petty, proud, obnoxious, vain, selfish, human, in other words. But they transcend that. And I think Steuben is perhaps one of the most evocative examples of that thing that we should appreciate about our history almost more than anything else. Thank you.
We have questions.
Yeah.
You were saying about the blue book and how they were given to the soldiers, but didn't a lot of people not know how to read in this?
Oh yeah. Good point. Here, I should have distinguished better between the soldier's book and the blue book. The soldier's book would be a little pamphlet, essentially, you carried around with you. It's your papers when you're a soldier, in other words. About the closest thing would be that, where all that would be recorded. And there, in a way, it doesn't really matter if you read or write, as long as your captain can, right? As long as somebody else can. Now, the blue book, which is the drill manual and the manual of procedures for the Army, how to run a court-martial, how to set up a bivouac, etc., that was not meant for ordinary soldiers. Not that they were not allowed to look at it, but it would be too expensive and it would be fruitless to give it to everybody. So it's intended really for company from sergeants on up, the people who would need to know the drill, for example, need to know the procedures. And by and large, NCOs tended to be literate. They kind of had to be, went with the territory. But good question, and I'm sorry I didn't distinguish better between the soldier's book and the blue book. They're two very different things. Yeah.
Did he meet with Lafayette when he returned?
When he returned, I'm sorry to.
When Lafayette returned.
Well, he returns in 1825, right? Does he return before that
right.
too?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's 30 some odd years after Steuben is dead. It's interesting to see that when they met face to face, as they often had to, they were quite polite to one another. But Lafayette would refer to Steuben as a mediocre Prussian, for example. I have to admit, having worked with Steuben for so long, I tend to inherit some of his prejudices, and I have a hard time really liking Lafayette all that much, at least as a combat commander, But one of my favorite quotes, and it's really awful, but I have to quote it anyway. I'm sorry. It's his words, not mine. When a friend of his wrote that Lafayette was a hit at the French court after the war, that the court ladies were all over him wanting to know all his stories, and Steuben wrote, "It doesn't surprise me. All women need their little miracle-producing Jesus." Which, again, I know it's awful from a 2025 perspective, but it shows you the bitterness between the two. They did not like each other at all. And fortunately, they really didn't have to work together that much. Yeah?
The land where he built his house upstate?
Yes.
Was he given that land as part of his pay?
No, that was actually it was actually a patent he invested in. He did receive quite a few grants of land, though, as pay. Of course, this is a way that that Congress dealt very often with soldiers' bounties, with land. Some of it's really awful. I think of the land grants, for example, in northern New York, like St. Lawrence County. I mean, who would want to move there to farm? I'm sorry, I lived in Potsdam for 4 years. I can't imagine why anybody would voluntarily live in St. Lawrence County to farm. It's all rocks and sub 20 temperatures, sub negative 20 temperatures. But he did have significant grants in Virginia and Pennsylvania, and remember where else. Those are the big ones. The Virginia patent, we just found this out maybe a couple of years after Drillmaster came out. The Virginia patent, of course, Virginia claimed a lot of lands west of the Alleghenies and along the Ohio Valley, including apparently a fair amount of land in Clinton County, Ohio. Not that far from where I live. It's in southwestern Ohio. Virginia patent actually extended to incorporate what today is the town of Wilmington, Ohio. Steuben never saw it. It's in this deed book from like the 1820s. This land belongs to Steuben, who's now been dead for a quarter century. But yeah, so the land in upstate New York, though, that was part of a larger purchase. He actually, and one thing I didn't go into, he got involved in a number of land settlement schemes. There are a whole bunch of these, of course, floating around in the 1780s and 1790s, some of which were borderline treasonous in dealing with the Spanish, for example. But yeah, that was a different. And the land, of course, was ridiculously cheap. It wasn't cleared and it wasn't near anything. It was reasonably free of danger of attack from Native Americans, but not a place that a man of Steuben's age should have been starting over. Probably, as a pretty rough job. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Elaine Hayes. I'm the Executive Director of Mount Gulian Historic Site. Welcome to the site. Professor, what is your recommendation? How would you recommend docents to answer the question, which we get here at Mount Gulian, was von Steuben gay?
That's a real, and I'll give you an anecdote as background, and I hope it helps somewhat, but I'll get a conclusion from it. I get this a lot, as you can imagine, because of Drillmaster. And the only person I know who gets the question almost as much as I do, I wish I could remember his name, and I can't. He's the editor of a gay newspaper in Philadelphia. And he and I talk a lot about this. And he's told me outright, he goes, I know you think we can't prove that he was or wasn't. I want to believe that he was. That's what he said to me. And part of it was that we want to have a gay founding father. I understand the urgency behind that. But again, so I would argue is different between heritage and history to a certain extent. Whether we're analyzing history, for what we have in front of us or what we would like it to be. I've had individuals approach me like him who have pointed out, can you prove that he was gay? And I simply tell them, no, I can't. The things that are usually brought up, like he used the word love a lot when talking to his subordinates, to his staff members. Well, it's kind of not an unusual thing in the 18th century to tell your friends of the same sex that you love them. That's acceptable to show your emotions like that. On the other hand, a few years ago, Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, it contacted me because their mascot is the Baron. And Franciscan, as you can imagine, is a very, very Catholic institution. So they contacted me. Many of our donors don't like the fact that our mascot is gay. And I wanted to try to respond to that. Can you tell them that he wasn't gay? And I simply had to say, no, I can't. There's the jury's really out on it because there is evidence that he probably had a good chance that he had a heterosexual relationship with a woman in Germany, very likely his patroness. And there is circumstantial evidence to the contrary. So you know, my point has always been, we can't say for sure, but does it really matter? And not everybody likes that answer. Franciscan didn't, the PR people of Franciscan didn't like that. They sent me a very nice hoodie as a compensation for my time, but that was really about it. So yeah, it's a tough question. No matter how you slice it, and that is the thing I think that's kept over the past few years, that's kept Steuben in the public eye. Is that issue. Now, another one that comes up, I should bring, in case anybody does bring this up, you know, one of the reasons he's very often alleged to have left Europe in such a hurry is that he had word from his friends at the court of Baden-Durlach that there had been accusations leveled against him that he had taken liberties with young boys entrusted to his care. There were never any formal charges brought up, nothing ever specified. It's as likely that this was just something fabricated by somebody who didn't like him, and there were those who didn't like him. But the reason I bring this up is I've had increasingly people contacting me saying, how can you admire Steuben when he's clearly a pedophile? No, we have somebody talking about this one letter. That's all we have. So you know, that does come up often too, unfortunately. Yeah.
I can't remember where I researched Steuben myself. I'm a reenactor, by the way.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And somewhere along the line, I remember reading that he had a locket on him of a woman's picture.
Yes.
And I don't know what, either North or his other aide questioned that, and it was verboten. You couldn't talk about it.
He said she was a matchless woman.
And it could have been that.
And he closed it.
Noble, yes.
Yes.
And
He never identified her. North thought it was probably Friederike of Hohenzollern.
it broke his heart.
Yeah.
And that's why he never married.
Yeah. Well, she was already married. I mean, she was married to the Duke of Württemberg.
Okay.
So she was not available, you know, but she was very fond of him. We know that she is the person who probably did more than anybody else to try to find him positions at European court. She got him the position as a courtier at Hohenzollern-Hechingen. She got him nominated for the Hausorden der Treue. So she clearly cared for him a great deal. But yeah, I think it's really easy to connect those dots and think, you know, this might have been his love, you know, and again, that's what I was alleging to in terms of the possible relationship with a woman in Germany. We don't know. I mean, there's just really nothing there. And one thing that becomes really apparent, and this is from a man who in so many ways wore his heart on his sleeve. I mean, Steuben is angry. It's almost hilarious reading his correspondence because he just lets it all out. You know, and sometimes it's a mixture of French and English. By the way, he wrote more in French than he did in German by a huge margin. The amount of his documents written in German actually is fairly small, but a lot in French. When he wrote down his thoughts to himself, they were mostly in French. English was kind of a second, and in German was not a distant third. But anyway, he clearly, where it comes to affairs of the heart, he just doesn't talk. You know, as a man who just, I know I concluded in Drillmaster, as a man who just simply didn't know how to have an intimate relationship with anybody, emotionally intimate relationship with anybody. He just could not open up. And I think hence we did very, very, very few people who really got to see the Baron from the inside. There's a couple like Richard Peters in Philadelphia, I think. But by and large, is a man who was outwardly very, very open and inwardly very, very tightly shut.
He's German.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, there you go.
He's from Prussia back in the 70s.
Yeah.
My great-great-grandfather from Königsberg. And I'm also Bavarian, so that kind of melts it out a little bit.
Yeah, but very different.
My wife will say this, I am very close-lipped and I'm very excitable because I'm German. And Irish.
And Irish.
All right, thank you. Dr. Lockhart has brought some books. If anyone is interested in buying the Drillmaster of Valley Forge. So we are doing a basket giveaway in a few minutes. If you haven't signed up yet, all right, please do. Maybe, Chris, if you want to raise your hand if you haven't signed up yet. This is our silly way of getting your zip code, because part of our grant, we got a grant from Dutchess County to hold this, is to get people's zip codes. I think it's for marketing or something, so. So please fill those out, and then we'll call the name at the end. And we'd like to thank, of course, Dutchess County, who gave us the grant, the folks at Mount Gulian, Gabe and Elaine, thank you so much. I know when I was thinking about what speaker we wanted to come for our Rev 250 speaker program, I was thinking, well, I'm part of the Steuben Society. I know Steuben's headquarters is in Dutchess County, and I happen to know the biographer of Steuben, and it just all came together, and that was great. So thank you to Mount Gulian and the Steuben Society and everybody for coming tonight. And if you can't get enough of Dr. Lockhart, he is going to be speaking tomorrow at the LaGrange Library on a different topic on doing history. So you're welcome to come to LaGrange Library on Route 55 at 6 p.m. to watch part 2 of Dr. Lockhart's speech. All right. And we have refreshments outside, thanks to the Steuben Society, so help yourself to some refreshments. And we do have my friend Chris, who is a Steuben reenactor, so I think we might want to have him come up and take some pictures with Dr. Lockhart. And I don't know if anyone else wants to take some pictures, but Steuben and Washington's portrayed by my husband. They are in the Steuben Parade in New York City in September, and this will be their 3rd year of being on the lead float going down Fifth Avenue in September. So it's an awesome time. Thank you so much for coming. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow night as well. I'll be calling the name in a minute. Oh, good.
Yeah, because I'd be surprised how big a deal that is that they're offering officers. Even if it's a cold water or no water, it's shot at.
Oh, don't encourage them, Kathy.
Back then, when I appeared, because you could grab it.
Oh, yeah.
Sword fight.
Also the lice.
Yeah, that's
Just like saying with short hair, of course, the short hair is.
absolutely.
Are you able to grab a photo of you gentlemen?
Yeah, sure.
All right, let me just have Steuben pick the winner.
My big handy.
Just one, Mr.
I
Steuben.
am trying.
All right, we got a winner.
Probably not mine, because I folded.
And the winner is Antonia Houston
Very good. I enjoyed the presentation.
from Fishkill.
I think about Steuben, he put together the rules
Yeah, the blue book, yeah.
that the military army still uses today.
Well, a lot of based off of that. And the big part of that was, this is very, very new in the 18th century, was this notion that officers should love their soldiers as if they were their children. In other words, be stern with them, but also be kind and understanding and listen to them. Which was, pretty progressive way of